I was standing in the middle of a spruce clearing 12 miles north of the Notikewin Road, looking down at something I could not explain away, and Bess was sitting beside my left boot with her ears up toward the tree line and her tail moving slow and easy, the way she sat when she was comfortable and paying attention to something she had decided was not a threat. She was not growling. She was not pressed against my leg. She was just sitting there, calm as a dog by a wood stove, watching the trees. I had 3 explanations ready in my head before I even crouched down to look, and by the time I stood up again, all 3 of them were gone. That was the fall of 2009. I was 57 years old, and I had been carrying what my grandmother gave me for 38 years by then. I am 73 now. My name is Russell Sutton, and I spent 32 years driving rural mail routes in the Peace Country of northern Alberta, and I have not told this in full to anyone. My wife Corinne knew the shape of it, some of it, before she passed in 2019, but I kept the center of it from her the way you keep a sore tooth from your tongue, testing the edges but not pressing into the hurt. My mother Lorraine knew more than I did for most of my life, and she died in 2003, still insisting that what Edna Sutton saw and promised and lived by was the truest thing in the family. I thought Lorraine was grieving the wrong way for a long time. I was mistaken about that. So I'm telling it now because I am the last one who carries it, and carrying things to the grave is a habit I have decided to break. I understand how it sounds. I want you to know I understand that before I say another word. My grandmother was named Edna Sutton, and she was a lay midwife in the Peace Country from the early 1930s until 1963, when her hands got bad enough that she stopped traveling. In that time, she attended something in the range of 240 births across a homestead belt that ran from the town of Manning East through the river country, covering ground that most people in southern Alberta still do not have a clear picture of. She was not licensed in the way that word means today. No one required that of her. What the homestead families required was that she could get there in winter, that she kept calm under conditions that would rattle a salaried nurse at a city hospital, and that she knew the difference between a presentation that would resolve on its own and one that would not. She knew all of those things. She had learned them from her own mother, who had learned them from a woman in Saskatchewan whose name I was never told. She drove a 1946 International half-ton from about 1948 onward. And before that, she went by horse when she had to, and by foot once or twice when there was no other option. She kept a canvas bag with instruments and clean cloth and 2 kinds of carbolic solution, and she kept a record book in a fireproof tin box under the seat of that truck. I still have that box. I have never shown the record book to anyone, and I'm not going to describe what is written in it beyond saying that the entries for certain calls in certain years are in a different hand from the rest, and that my grandmother was not a woman who let anyone else touch her records. I want to be precise about who Edna was, because the account I am going to give you will not make sense if you do not have a picture of the woman. She was not someone who embellished. She was not someone who frightened easily, or who expressed wonder in large words. When my grandfather came home from the war with one hand and a changed temper, she reorganized the farm to account for both facts and never said a word to anyone about how hard that was. When my mother was 17 and came home in a state that required some private management, Edna handled it without drama or recrimination, and the subject was never raised again in our household. She was a practical woman in the way that the northern homestead country made practical women, which is to say, she was practical the way a good axe is practical, without any softness that was not chosen. She told me exactly once about the 1952 call. She was dying when she told me. She had been sick since the spring of 1971, and by November of that year, It was clear that the sickness was going to finish what it had started, and she asked me to come sit with her one afternoon when my mother had gone to the store in Peace River. I was 19 years old. I had been working at the grain elevator in Grimshaw for about 8 months, the first real job I had held, and I drove the 40 miles to her farmhouse that afternoon, thinking she wanted to talk about her effects or the disposition of the land. She did not want to talk about any of that. She was sitting up in the bed with a wool blanket across her legs and her record book open on the coverlet beside her. And she looked at me for a moment before she spoke, the way she always looked at a person when she was deciding something. Then she said, "You are the one I'm going to tell this to. Not your mother, not your uncles. You. Do you understand that means you are the one who keeps it?" I said I understood. She said, "You will not tell it while I am alive. You will not tell it while your mother is alive. After that, it is your judgment." She paused and coughed once, the dry cough she had developed by then. "There is a place 12 miles north of the Notikewin Road. You know the spruce clearing where the road forks near the old Hendricks homestead. Past that, north, following the creek drainage, and you will find a second clearing with a deadfall on the east side. You do not go there to look. You do not go there to disturb anything. You leave what you find alone. Do you understand me?" I said I did. She looked at me for another long moment, and then she said, "All right," and she closed the book and she told me about the 1952 call. The call came in October of that year, which was its own problem because October in the Peace Country is not a forgiving month for a 12-mile drive on a track that was not much more than 2 ruts in spruce root and muskeg. She had received calls from that direction before from the Hendricks family and one other homestead family whose name I was not given. This call was not from either of them. It came through a neighbour who had been given a message to pass along, and the message said only that there was a woman in need of help, north of the Hendricks place, and that Edna was the one being asked for specifically. She drove as far as she could and then walked. She said it was 4 miles on foot in the dark, and she had a lantern and her bag. She did not describe being afraid of that walk. She described the ground, the way it was frozen on top and soft underneath, and she described the sound of the creek on her left. She had delivered babies in difficult circumstances before. The walk itself was not the strange part. What she found at the end of the walk was a clearing with a deadfall on the east side and a fire built low, and something she spent a great deal of her life after that finding words for. She did not use a single word I would repeat to you, because she did not use the words that exist for it in the usual accounts. She said she came into the clearing and there was a fire, and beside the fire there was a figure large enough that her first thought was that there had been some confusion and she had come to the wrong place. Then the figure turned toward the firelight, and she understood that she had not come to the wrong place, and also that the categories she had carried into that clearing were not adequate to what was in it. She set down her bag because she said her hands understood, before her mind did, that the reason she had been called was present and needed attending to. She went to work. She did not describe the particulars of the birth in any way I am going to give to you, partly because she told them to me in a register that felt private and should stay that way, and partly because I believe she would not have wanted those particulars passed further than the one keeper she chose. What she told me was this: she was there from roughly 11 in the evening until past 3 in the morning. She did what she was called to do. The birth resolved. There was a living child. When it was over, she said she sat back on her heels and looked at what she had brought into the world, and for a long moment she did not think anything at all. Then she thought, in her practical way, that she needed to wash her hands. She told me that, after some time had passed, The large figure came around to where she was crouched cleaning her instruments and set something down beside her bag. It was a piece of birch bark about the size of a book, and on it were two things. A mat of dried plants she recognized as a specific route she had used herself in labor, the proper one, presented correctly, and laid across the top of that, a carved piece of something she said was antler, smoothed down to a point, which she understood in the way you understand a thing offered in return without language, to be a gift. She took the carved piece. She left the root mat beside the fire. She picked up her bag and she walked back to her truck. She drove home and she put the carved piece in her fireproof tin box, and she wrote down the call in her record book in her own hand, but the date and nothing more. No location, no names, no particulars. And she kept that ordinance for 19 years, going back twice that she admitted to, both times leaving something at the edge of that clearing, both times finding that whatever she had left was gone before her next visit. She told me there were 2 more years after 1952 when she received a call from that direction, both times in early winter, both times in the small hours, and both times she went. She did not describe those calls in any detail. She said only that they resolved, and that she honored whatever was asked of her, and that she was never given any reason to be afraid. When she finished telling me all of this, she reached into the tin box and took out the carved antler piece and set it in my hand. It was heavy for its size. It had been worn smooth in one spot from being held. She said, "That is what I am leaving you. You know where the clearing is. You leave it alone. And someday, if it seems right, you tell someone." She died 11 days later. I carried that antler piece in my coat pocket for 32 years of male route. I'm not being poetic about that. I mean that literally. It was in the left breast pocket of whatever coat I was wearing while I drove those roads, from the day I started driving them in 1975 until the day I retired in 2007. I could not have told you why. I did not examine the habit closely. The mail route I worked covered a stretch of the homestead belt east of Peace River that overlapped almost exactly with the country Edna had driven in her midwifery years. Some of the box numbers belonged to grandchildren of families she had attended. I knew the land the way you know, a thing you have driven 4 mornings a week for 3 decades, which is to say I knew it the way other people know the rooms of their own house. I knew where the frost came earliest and stayed latest. I knew which sections of gravel road turned soft in the April thaw and which ones held. I knew the exact point where the spruce closed in on the north side of the Notikewin Road, and the light changed and the radio went to static. I tried to explain away what Edna had told me, on and off, for years. The first explanation I settled on in my 20s was that she had been feverish when she told it, and that the account was a deathbed confusion, a dream she had built into a memory, the way sick people sometimes do. I held that explanation until 1983, when I was driving the north leg of my route in late October, and Bess, who was in the truck with me as she often was on cold days, came suddenly upright in the passenger seat with her ears forward and her attention on the tree line to the left, a 1/4 mile or so into the timber. I slowed down. Bess did not growl. She did not press against the door. She sat straight and watched, tail moving twice, slow, and I watched with her. And about 40 yards into the trees, I saw something standing still between 2 large spruce. The light was low, and the trees were dense, and I'm not going to tell you I got a clear look at it. I am going to tell you that it was large in a way that did not correspond to any animal I knew in that country, and that it was upright, and that after perhaps 30 seconds it turned and moved north into the timber without any sound I could hear through the truck window, and Bess watched it go and then looked at me and then lay back down. I sat there for probably 2 minutes. Then I drove on. I delivered the rest of the route. When I got home that evening, I told Corinne I had seen a bear, which was close enough to something true that the words came out without difficulty, and I did not think much more about it for several years. The second explanation I had tried before 1983 was that Edna's account was a piece of peace country folklore she had absorbed over the decades and eventually come to believe, the way isolated people sometimes fold old stories into their own experience. I gave up on that one after that October afternoon, because Edna had not been the kind of woman who absorbed other people's narratives and called them her own, and because of Bess. The third explanation I tried across most of the 1990s was that I had seen a large man in dark clothing on that one afternoon, someone working a trapline, and that Edna's account, while probably rooted in something real, had been shaped by decades of telling and retelling in her own mind into something larger than the original. That explanation lasted until my mother died in 2003. Lorraine had spent the better part of her adult life trying to get someone in the family to engage seriously with what Edna had told, without knowing the specific details Edna had told only to me. She knew the outline of it, the way you know an outline when your mother has never quite said the center of a thing, but has circled it in plain view your whole life. She used to say, when I would change the subject, "Russell, your grandmother was not a woman who made things up." I would say I knew that, and change the subject, and she would let me, and then she would raise it again 3 months later with a different approach. In the last year of her life, when she was in the hospital in Grande Prairie with the heart condition that eventually took her, she called me one afternoon and said, "I want you to go see that clearing. Before one of us is gone who still knows where it is." I said I would. She said, "I mean it. Go look at the ground." I said I would, and I meant it, and then she died in March of 2003 before I had gone, and I did not go for another 6 years because grief takes things in a specific order, and it took my intentions in that direction before it took anything else. In the fall of 2009, 2 years after I retired from the route, I drove out to the Notikewin Road on a Tuesday in late September with Bess in the passenger seat, who was 11 years old by then, and moved carefully when she got out of the truck, but still moved. I parked where the road forked near the old Hendricks property, and I walked north, following the creek drainage, with a tin box in my pack, and Bess on a loose lead beside me. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I am aware that a man of my age and background describing what he found in a spruce clearing is going to sound a particular way, and I cannot control that. I can only tell you what I saw. The clearing was there. Edna had described it accurately in every particular. The deadfall on the east side, the way the spruce opened up around a rough oval of ground maybe 40 feet across, the creek audible on the left. The deadfall was older now, half-rotted, with young growth coming up through it, but it was the right deadfall in the right position. On the ground near the base of the deadfall, partially under a lip of bark that had peeled away, there were 2 things. The first was a set of impressions in the soil, which was still soft from rain the previous week, in a line moving from the north side of the clearing toward the deadfall and back. I measured them against my boot, which is a size 11. I measured them 3 times, in 3 different impressions, because my first measurement did not seem like something I should accept on a single check. The length was close to twice my boot. The spacing was 4 feet, more or less, from heel of one to heel of the next. The depth in that soft soil was deeper than my own boot pressed in the same ground beside them. The second thing was a small mat of dried plant material, bound with a strip of inner bark and laid deliberately, not blown there, not fallen, in the notch where the deadfall met the soil. I recognized the plant from my grandmother's descriptions. It was the same root material she had described being offered to her in 1952, presented in the same way, bound in the same manner. I crouched down and looked at it for a long time. Bess sat beside me and looked at the tree line, calm and interested, the way she had sat in the truck in 1983. I understood several things standing up from that crouch, in a sequence, one following the other, the way facts do when you have been keeping them separate, and they suddenly refuse to stay separated. I understood that my grandmother had told me exactly what happened, and nothing more and nothing less. I understood that what she had attended in that clearing in 1952 had not been a singular event. I understood that the dried plant material at the base of the deadfall had not been there before the rain the previous week, because it would have been ruined by the moisture if it had, and it was dry and intact and correctly presented. Someone had left it recently. Someone who knew, I thought, in the way I thought carefully about this. Someone who knew that the woman who had come in October 1952 and the 2 times after, and twice more in a different decade, was no longer coming, and had perhaps found a way to mark that knowing. I cannot tell you that is what it was. I am telling you that is what it looked like to me, standing in that clearing with a retired mail carrier's 4 decades of reading country behind me, in the same way I would read a section of road for signs of what had passed over it. I reached into my pack and I took out the tin box and I opened it. The carved antler piece was inside where it had been since I retired and stopped carrying it in my coat. I took it out and I looked at it for a moment. The worn, smooth spot was still worn smooth. Then I laid it at the edge of the mat of dried plants in the notch of the deadfall, and I stood up and I closed the box and I put it back in my pack. Bess looked at me once, briefly, with the attentive expression she used when she was waiting for me to decide something. I told her we were going, and she stood up and moved beside me toward the south edge of the clearing. I stopped once at the tree line and looked back. The clearing sat the way clearings sit in spruce country, enclosed and still. The deadfall on the east side, the carved piece now at its base. The light was flat and grey, the kind of light the peace country makes in September late in the afternoon, and the spruce wall on the north side was dark enough that 10 feet into it you could not see anything. I did not hear anything. I looked for perhaps 30 seconds, and then I turned and walked back to the truck. I drove home with my hand resting on the top of the steering wheel the way my grandmother used to rest her hand on the wheel of the International, and I thought about Lorraine. I thought that she had been right for a long time, and that I had let her be right alone for most of it, because it was easier than accepting what it meant. She had not needed me to tell her the center of the thing. She had needed me to go look at the ground the way she said. She had told me to go before one of us was gone who knew where it was. I had gone and she was not there to know that I had, and I sat with that on the drive home in the way you sit with things you cannot give to the person they belong to. That was 15 years ago. I am 73 now, and Bess is a different Bess, a younger dog of the same breed who came to me 3 years after the first one died, and she has the same habit of sitting up straight and easy at the tree line when something is there, which I have noticed twice from the truck on early runs up the Notikewin Road since I retired. I do not stop. I drive on. The ordinance my grandmother gave me was not to go looking, and I have not gone looking again since 2009, and I do not intend to. What Edna gave me, standing in front of that tin box on a November afternoon in 1971, was not simply the account of a birth. What she gave me was the weight of a trust that a thing she could not name had placed in her across 3 visits in the 1950s, and however many years before, that she had not told me about, and her considered decision, after 19 years of carrying it, that the trust was real, and worth honoring and worth passing to someone who would continue to honor it. She had picked me over my mother and over my 3 uncles, all of whom were older than I was, and I have thought about why she chose me specifically, and I still do not have a satisfying answer. What I have is the fact that she chose me, and that I have tried to be the thing she thought I was. I do not know what kind of thing it was that my grandmother attended in that clearing. I do not know what it understood about what she had done. I can tell you that it offered her something correctly identified, the right plant for the right purpose, which is a form of knowledge I could not explain away no matter how many explanations I built for it across 30 years. I can tell you that whatever she had agreed to leave alone, she left alone, and that the country north of the Notikewin Road was the same country I drove past 4 mornings a week for 32 years, and it never once felt threatening to me. Not in the way that wild country sometimes does when you have the low, clear feeling that you are not alone and not wanted. It never felt that way. It felt, and I'm going to use this word plainly, watched. Not hunted. Watched. The difference is one I trust after 3 decades of knowing that ground. My mother was right that Edna was not a woman who made things up. I should have gone to the clearing sooner and found out what was in it, and told Lorraine that she was right while she was still in a position to hear it. I carry that the way you carry things you cannot correct, and I'm not going to tell you it sits lightly, because it does not. The ordinance my grandmother gave me was simple. She said, "You know where the clearing is, you leave it alone, and someday, if it seems right, you tell someone." I kept the first 2 parts of that for 54 years. I think this is the 3rd part. I think this is the someday she was talking about. I am 73, and I am not going to outlast this by the kind of margin that justifies keeping it any longer. I have stopped needing to know what kind of thing it was. I stopped needing that somewhere between the 1st and 2nd decade of carrying the antler piece in my pocket, and I made my peace with not knowing the way you make peace with most of the things you are not going to know before you are done. What I know is what I watched and what I measured, and what my grandmother told me with her record book open beside her, and 11 days left. I know she was not afraid of what she had been called to attend. I know she went back twice on her own. I know she chose to leave the carved piece to me rather than to anyone else. And I know that I left it where it had, I think, been looking for since 1963, which is the last year she was able to drive. Bess is asleep beside my chair right now, her chin on her front paws the way she settles in the evening. The tin box is on the shelf in the next room, empty now for 15 years. And somewhere north of the Notikewin Road, in a spruce clearing with a deadfall on the east side, things continue as they have continued, unhurried, at a scale and pace that does not particularly require my understanding. I hope whatever is there knows that the woman who came in, October 1952, did what she came to do, and did it well, and kept the faith. She was the best of us. It should know that, if it does not.